Welcome back to the Deeper 2025 podcast. I'm so excited that you're with us today. And today we are continuing to follow along the story of Paul as he's in prison. As we saw a couple of days ago, Paul is falsely accused by the Jewish leaders, the religious leaders, and he finds himself in prison. He finds himself in front of Governor Felix. Governor Felix is somewhat feels beholden to the Jews. He doesn't make a decision. Then we see that Festus, I think these names are hilarious, I just have to say that, but Festus takes over for Felix. Festus then calls him in, and Paul, being a Roman citizen, appeals to Caesar, which would be like us appealing to the Supreme Court, the highest council in the land. This is the man that could decide whether to free him or to put him to death. And he says, I appeal to Caesar. And so Festus decides, okay, he's appealed to Caesar. So then King Agrippa comes in, and King Agrippa comes into town, and Festus goes to Agrippa and says, hey, there's this guy Paul. The Jewish leaders want him dead. I don't see any reason for him to be dead, but he's appealed to Caesar. But before he goes to Caesar, I think he needs to talk to you. And so we see this exchange in Acts chapter 26. It's Paul. In fact, the chapter starts out with King Agrippa saying, hey, Paul, you may speak. Go ahead and present your case. And we see that Paul uses that time to present not only his case, but also to present the gospel. Paul boldly shares his testimony before King Agrippa, and he talks about his conversion. He talks about the mission that he has to proclaim the good news of Jesus, and he uses that time to really paint a picture of what the gospel is all about. And so how does that apply to us as we are dealing with this? Now, at the end of chapter 24, we find that after he meets with Felix, he's been in prison for 2 years. And at the end of 2 years, Festus takes over for Felix, and the Bible very clearly in the last verse of chapter 24 says that Felix did a favor for the Jews, and he kept Paul in prison. So Paul has been in prison for a while, but now he's before Agrippa, and he gives this testimony of what God has done in his life. And I want you to think, we talked about this last time, Paul was a man that was a persecutor of Christians. He was a killer of Christians, and now he's had this dramatic change to where he is a Christian. He is a follower of Jesus, and so he gives this account. And I think for us, there's a couple of things that kind of parallel with Acts 24, but I think sometimes God has to tell us multiple times and show us multiple times before we can actually get it. The first one is to be bold in our testimony. God has given you a story. God has given you a beautiful story. And maybe that story is a lot like mine. I grew up in church and realized that going to church and good works weren't going to get me to heaven, and so I needed something else. I needed something bigger, and that bigger was a relationship with Jesus. Or maybe for some of you, you've got more a dramatic story of how God rescued you from a life of sin and a life of just straying from Him and being so far away from Him. No matter what God has given you in your story, you have to be bold to share that story. So again, as I asked 2 days ago in our podcast on Acts 24, how can you use your testimony to point others to Jesus? Paul is in front of a man who can put him to death. King Agrippa has the power to say, you know what, Paul, you're just going to rot in jail. You know what, Paul, you're done. But Paul uses the platform that God gives him through being falsely imprisoned, mind you, to share the gospel and share his testimony. So be bold. Here's the second thing. This is another recap from the other day, but we've got to obey God's call immediately. We can't delay in obeying what God has called us to do. Paul did not delay in responding to Christ. When he met Jesus on the Damascus Road, he did not delay. When he becomes a follower of Jesus and Jesus gives him opportunities to share the gospel, he doesn't delay. He doesn't delay on his 3 missionary journeys. He doesn't delay God's call. And so we got to look at where is God calling us and what is God calling us to do, and then we've just got to go full force in that direction immediately. No hesitation, no delayed. We've got to do it right then. But then the other thing I think we see in this story is we've got to see every opportunity, every situation that we find ourselves in is an opportunity to share the gospel. every situation. Paul is not in a great situation right now. He's been in jail for over 2 years. Now, I want you to think for just a minute, you've been falsely accused, you've been thrown in jail, and I'm not talking about a jail where there's cable TV and there's lazy boys and all. I'm talking about a prison where pretty much you got just enough food to keep you alive, so you probably came out a lot thinner. That'd be a benefit for me. He's in chains. It's like dungeon-like jail. It's not like super air-conditioned jail. This is not a good situation that Paul finds himself in. And yet, even after 2 years plus in prison, he comes before King Agrippa, and I know what I would be saying in front of King Agrippa probably. You know, these fools have kept me in prison for 2 years on false charges. It's time for you to let me go. But that's not what Paul does. Paul sees every situation as an opportunity to share the gospel. And so he starts sharing his story and sharing what God has done in his life and sharing how good Jesus is. And so even in hardship, we have to find ways and see it as an opportunity to share the gospel. In fact, I would say this, that when you're in your deepest, darkest situation, maybe the deepest, darkest situation you've ever been in, that is the perfect opportunity to share the gospel because nobody's expecting it. Everybody's expecting for you to moan and groan about what's going on in your life and how things are not going right. But when things are at their hardest, when things are at their darkest, that is the perfect opportunity to share the gospel and bring glory to Jesus. So let's be obedient to what God's calling us to do. Let's see the opportunity that's before us. One prayer that I like to pray a lot when I get my day started is, God, would you just help me to see like you can see? Would you help me to see the opportunities you put before me today? And may you give me boldness to take those opportunities and to share what you want me to share. So maybe today, that's your prayer. Maybe today it's, God, what opportunity do you want me to see today? May I have eyes like you have. May I see like you see. And then may you give me boldness to share the great testimony that you've given me today.